Oh, it's already recording. Yeah, last time I recorded it, just did this big because my screen's vertical, so it recorded the wrong way.
Yeah.
Um, Screen.
There we go.
What is it showing? Is it showing one window or is it showing everything?
Just the one. Just OPAR chapter 5
Oh,
and
your
your
screen
Gmail.
sharing. Okay, cool. Let me just go to this and all right, well, I can't see you anymore, but that doesn't matter. We'll just go through this. Okay. So let's see. This was a section about the arbitrary. And so he talks about the onus of proof principle.
Yeah.
And he says the onus of proof principle. Oh, here we go. The onus of proof principle states the following. If a person asserts that a certain entity exists, such as God, gremlins, a disembodied soul, he is required to adduce evidence supporting his claim. If he does so, one must either accept this conclusion or disqualify his evidence by showing that he has misinterpreted certain data. It sounds like the same as the basically like what this is getting at is the same thing as the arbitrary.
Yeah. I mean, it's at least as far as discussions go, if somebody makes a claim, it's on them to provide the evidence. If they're making the claim, they should have some kind of evidence, and that's really what he's saying. It's not like you could just say something, well, just say, well, I don't know, it's possible. Like he's just, if you're making the claim, you should offer some evidence.
Right. And
Kind of like
what's
what?
different?
Mm,
What's different about this from like the arbitrary? It sounds like it's basically the same thing. I don't see what this
it's
chapter is at.
similar. It's not that much different. I mean, we could maybe distinguish whether their claim actually is arbitrary, but as far as the discussion goes, you if somebody makes a claim, then you can say to them, well, what's the evidence? That it's not like they can avoid that question. Not like it's like they can't just say, oh, prove that it's not true. And that would be, if they're just telling you prove that it's not true, more or less their claim's probably arbitrary, that they don't have anything to support it. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's basically would be that if you can't provide the evidence, it's an arbitrary. And like you were saying yesterday, somebody could just say something. Maybe they do have some evidence, they just don't want to share it. So at least that's what I say as far as the discussion goes. If they're not providing that evidence, and the onus is on them to provide the evidence. If they're not providing it, then you could dismiss it as arbitrary.
So I remember about Popper talking about
Yeah.
a principle of falsifiability. Um,
Yes.
is that I haven't studied Popper, but do you happen to know if that is similar? As in, it sounds like if something is falsifiable, you know it's not arbitrary. So
Yes. I
do
mean,
you
there's
think he
nothing.
was getting at the same thing?
I don't think so. It was more. Well, for one, it was more focused on science as a principle of scientific reasoning and the nature of how science should work. I mean, I guess yeah, it could be go to broader things, but falsifiability means if you could like construct an experiment to demonstrate if it is true or false, and that could be fine usually, but he's trying to the way he thinks of it, as far as I understand Popper, is that claims can only have to do with falsifiability. If you can falsify them or not. If you can't falsify it in principle, then you can dismiss the claim entirely, which in a way think of like existence exists. You can't come up with an experiment to falsify that, to prove that it might be false.
Right.
And it's difficult and not really a tenable idea for foundationalism in philosophy, like
Got it.
the way objectivism works, like it's based on these undeniable premises. And Popper would say those undeniable premises are inadmissible in any kind of rational discussion because you can't falsify it. But on the other hand, it does make sense sometimes to be able to falsify a claim if you're asking for evidence to demonstrate a claim. I guess in a way you could say you're asking proof that it could be otherwise, or I shouldn't say that. I should say that you're asking for something to demonstrate whether it is true or false, and that you could disprove the claim or prove the claim, either direction. But you can't prove existence exists, and so that's where you run into problems with this principle of falsifiability.
Yeah, I'm looking him up because I'm wondering if maybe he came from a scientific context, in which case, within that context, maybe
Kind
his
of.
ideas work really
Part of
well.
it was he wanted to like disprove Marxism and explain why like astrology is bad science. That's where he was coming from usually, like trying to explain
Yeah,
why those are bad.
got
But
it.
that's what he comes from, and kind of that tradition of like logical positivism, like the way you make the claim is like everything is about the way you make the claim.
Okay.
Even the language of it makes all the difference. But that's where he's coming from.
Do you think that he? It's possible some of these philosophers like Popper, um, whatever their false ideas are, there's some very good ideas. As in, I'm just thinking of, so I know that in trading, a lot of people who have done very well are big fans of Popper. And I think when I think about it, it's, well, in trading, there is no certainty. You never get to that point where you have, at least as far as I'm aware, in my definitions of certainty, you're never certain. You don't know what the causes of things are. You often act on you act on incomplete information. And so it would make sense to me then that people would, even though his philosophy might be speaking more broadly about like even the fundamentals must be falsifiable in certain contexts, maybe his ideas work really well. It got me
Yeah,
thinking about.
I haven't studied him well enough to really say.
Yeah,
I
okay.
think some of his ideas are interesting as a way to present how to think of it, but there probably are better ways to use similar claims he makes. Like, it's not completely worthless to think about falsifiability, but there might be better principles to use, and that
Got it.
his justifications for that theory might not really work out. So the way he describes and talks about it might not be so helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see what this is about. Oh, okay. I'm trying to think of like, I'm trying to apply, this is more a question of application in thinking. So like if someone asks you, why don't you like X? Or like, so why don't you like tennis? Is that, would it be arbitrary to, is that the arbitrary? Because I need a reason either to like or dislike it. So I can't answer why I don't like X. I don't know if that's the arbitrary. Like this whole thing of nothing follows from nothing. So like if I don't have a feeling about tennis, then if I don't have an interest in it, then isn't that the lack of? So you can't really say why you feel a lack of something. You can only say why you feel something.
I think that is partly true that you can't explain why something doesn't. I'm trying to think of a good way to phrase that. Like
Yeah, I couldn't.
it's more like proving that non-existence is what this seems to be about. Like more like
It's
proving
about this.
prove that you didn't murder that guy on Sixth Avenue yesterday. Like prove that you didn't. Think of it that way. Like
Right.
it's just out of nowhere. Like, oh, you can't prove it, then maybe you're guilty. Like that's
Right.
kind of like
So
proving a negative. Like prove to me that you didn't murder somebody yesterday. Like it's just
give
there's
give me a reason for something for which you, I don't know how to say it. Yeah, it's like ask for a reason. It's like the same thing as like explain to me why existence exists. Um, but is it? Is it if it's proving a negative, is that explain why existence exists? Is that similar? Because you're stepping out, like you're basically um yeah, you're
I
stepping
don't
out
think
of
he's. I think he proved a negative in quotes because he didn't mean that like literally like he put in quotes just like just when people say that they're referring to something. So what he means when he says that is making the proving the non-existence of an entity. Like prove that God doesn't exist. But you can't if God doesn't exist, you would be saying there is no possible evidence to even be found within reality. If you're making that claim he doesn't exist. Like you can't prove that God doesn't exist. And
right.
any theist might say, oh, God, you can't prove he doesn't exist, so maybe he does. You shouldn't deny God. But we're trying to talk about evidence in the first place. And if you're making a claim that it doesn't exist, then by nature you're saying there is no evidence.
So I guess this doesn't relate to my question then. It just made me think about when you ask why existence exists and you can't because you have to step out of it. Um,
Yeah, but I think that's different because you're asking to say prove that it does exist.
yeah.
And you can prove that something does exist, but you can't prove that non-existence exists. Like or prove that gremlins exist. Or prove that gremlins don't exist. Prove that reality doesn't exist.
Mm, okay.
Prove to
So
me that
then,
I'm conscious. Like prove to me that you're human. Like, well, maybe that's not a good example. Just we're like
yeah.
proving the non-existence of things. Like, I mean, you
Okay.
could
I
think
think
of
what
it that way.
that bit I get, but I think what got me here was this then. Point out the facts of reality that follow from the non-existence of gremlins. So what I was getting at now, I just realized is if you if you ask someone like why don't you like whatever it is, but they don't, it's not that they don't like it, it's not that they like it, they just don't have any feelings about it. Isn't it similar in that you're asking them to point out the facts of reality follow from the non-existence of their interest in something? Like, why don't you like this thing? But they don't like it or dislike it, they have no feeling towards it. Or is that impossible because it's in reality and it's connected to everything else? Like if you don't like tennis, if you don't have an interest in it, there would be a reason for it. Is this related or not?
Prove the non-existence. I think he's really talking about just the.
Do you know what I'm
Um,
saying though? Because here is a thing. We could even, it doesn't matter. It could be an arbitrary claim too. Point out the
yeah.
facts that follow of reality that follow from, well, no, this is applicable actually, the non-existence of something. Now we're asking, why don't you like tennis? And in your mind, you don't care about tennis. You don't think about it. So would it make sense to ask someone, why don't you like tennis when they don't have a reaction either way? Because the reason I'm
Um.
asking this is I've often had people ask me a question like, why don't you like X or Y or Z? And I always thought like, well, I don't even think about it. I don't like it and I don't not like it. I can't answer why. How can I answer why don't I? Um,
I
I'm
guess
just
it
trying to find a way to
depends.
put that in words too, like what I'm trying to express in a more eloquent
Yeah,
way.
I know that's hard to put into words because
I can't say, well,
it's.
uh, the facts of reality do not follow from the non-existence of an entity. So I can't
I mean, in a
explain to you.
way, it depends how you could alter the phrasing of the claim. You could say prove that you don't like tennis. Well, you could say, well, I have evidence that I feel neutral. I have evidence that I know that might seem like getting around it entirely, but it seems like you could just reword the question in a way that you are asking. Still, you're making a positive claim about what kind of feeling you have. Like it's hard to say there's. I see what you're saying. It's hard to say that there's nothing, but I don't think there's another way to phrase prove that God doesn't exist. I guess it depends how you can transform the claim.
I thought you could always say, why should I like X? That's a, if someone asks you,
Yeah,
why don't you like X? You can say, why should I like
I
X?
just wish I had a better answer. I mean, it's easy to explain why the non-existence of entities is not prove the non-existence of a non-existent thing. I mean,
Yeah, this is a messier example, but that's why I like it.
yeah, I never really considered it that way because it's true. Yes, there isn't. Prove that you don't like tennis. Like, how can
Or
you?
why don't you? Why? Just go with why, because it's simpler.
Why don't
Yeah.
you like tennis? Um, I'm not sure that would be considered a negative claim. That's kind of what I'm unsure about. Is that actually a negative claim?
That's what I wasn't sure either. Because I even say, is it a case of nothing follows from nothing? And I can't say why. Or is there in this case something that I've made some, what happened? Oh, there we go. Yeah, something that what's going on here? Oh yeah, something that I've made some identification of and then not responded because it doesn't fit my values. So you can speak about it because it's in like, it's still a, what is this thing doing? Oh, there we go. It's down. We can come back to it.
I guess you could say that if you have,
Let me get my philosophy book and see. Oh, look at what I picked. Okay, yeah, anyway.
yeah, that is a good question, but I think how I would think of this is if you're trying to prove that you have no feelings about tennis, I guess you can't prove that they're not there. I'm trying to think, if you can't prove it's not there, could it be there still? Like, it would seem like, yeah, you can't prove it because there would be no evidence. You're saying there is no evidence, but you can't come up with evidence to prove that a thing doesn't exist. If it actually doesn't exist, you will never find evidence that it doesn't exist. It just doesn't.
Right. So it is an interesting question then, because it's like when you don't have a feeling for something, is it legitimate or good to ask yourself, why don't you like it? Or are there more
Probably not.
useful? Huh.
It probably is pointless to ask yourself, why not? Like, it's just, there is no evidence. If there is, in fact, no reason, if you, in fact, have no liking, you're not going to find the evidence that you don't like it. It's just absent in anything you do. It's just absent.
Right. So then the question, I guess, is how would you put that into a less philosophical, abstract academic terms? Meaning, if someone asks you that question, you're not going to say, well, let me tell you about the onus of proof principle and the fact that nothing follows from nothing. If you make a claim, you must introduce evidence. Like, okay, so the way I thought about it is, one, I try and not, unless I have a feeling for something, I'll try and not ask myself, why don't I like it? I'll try to be, what do I know about it? Or what should I like about it? If someone asks me, why don't you like it? But anyway, I was just curious because I thought this might be an application of it, something in here, which is cool because it's not it's not about God. It's not about gremlins on Mars reading Hegel's logic. It's about actual daily life.
Yeah, you could say that you have to reframe the way the question is being asked. If we don't think about proving why it's absent, think about proving with evidence why it should be there. Maybe you would think it actually might be there. Think about what there is, what you know, versus what
Yeah.
you might not know. Think in terms of what you see, not what you wish you could see.
Okay. Well, I'm happy moving on from there. So I guess you see something similar in that.
Yeah, you just reframe the way you think of it. If you're thinking in terms of prove a negative, prove this non-existent thing exists, or prove it doesn't exist, then reframe the question entirely. You're thinking about it wrong. It's not going to get you anywhere. Yeah, agnostic.
Yeah. So this is another one of his examples of which I have no knowledge whatsoever. I have not studied much other philosophy, so I have no idea if he's what he's summing up and who he's talking about. And so I was wondering if you know.
I mean, he's being very poetic about what agnosticism, what's wrong with agnosticism. He's saying like agnosticism is worse than believing in something that doesn't exist because you're not even taking any stand on it. That it's if you take no stand, if you say I don't know either one way or the other, and I'm just not sure, and there's no way to really know for sure, and you're kind of like abandoning notions of proof and evidence, at least as far as that claim goes. You might not do it everywhere in life, but the more things you're agnostic about, the worse it is. At least take a stand, whatever it might be.
Why?
You have the evidence and say it's either true or it's false. Don't say like, well, who knows? You might say I need more evidence. That's fine, but you don't want to take a standard principle that I'm never 100% sure. I'm only 99% sure at best for everything, but I'm never really sure. That's the sort of
Why?
thing he's
Why do
talking
you want
about.
to? Why is that bad?
Well, if you're never really sure, it means nothing's ever really certain. It means nothing's ever really grounded in a fact that it always could be otherwise. That there's no notion of certainty and no notion of what's a fact. There's only approximations.
And why is that subvert? Like, I don't understand why that's like the destroyer, the mind hater. I know people that are like a lot of people say that. Yeah, even in my line of work, like it's common. Maybe it's one of those things where within a certain context it's applicable, but then they generalize and apply to every context. You know what I'm saying? Like you work in a field, and then I think that's common. Like you work in a field, there are certain principles in your work, and then you try apply them to other field. Like I don't know, there's a field called econophysics. Like what's going on there? I have no idea. I don't see why physics is applicable to human relationships, but
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing. So in trading, there's everyone talks about Karl Popper, falsifiability, no certainty ever. And then I guess there's the generalization of that to everything else. But I don't see why this is so bad. Like at least I don't see it in such a concrete way of like it's still not that clear to me why it's so irrational and dangerous and so on.
Okay, so you're more asking like, why is it dangerous to have no certainty? Is that
Um, yeah, or just say to yourself, like, well, I'm 99% sure on everything. So, like, but everything is a probability. So, like, will I wake up tomorrow? I don't know. It's a probability. It's like, what's so dangerous about that? Like, or you say, I'm 99% sure God doesn't exist. Um, like, it's not as clear to me the consequences. But what I'm saying is, it's not that clear how that plays out in reality when it's actually implemented, if it is at all. Because people say that. I don't know if they must be
yeah?
acting on that or can't be. I have no idea.
I think people usually mean that to say they're fallible. I don't know if people usually mean it to say that they have no certainty about that belief. And that's more an error in how they phrase things,
Mm,
not an error of their knowledge per se.
right.
But let's say a person really does believe that they're not just saying that they could be wrong. They're just saying that even the facts of the nature of things, like there's no way to know, it's not possible. There's no such thing as certainty. It's a myth or something like that. Then I think you're destabilizing the notions of logic. Like certain things must follow logically that if there's a causal identity to everything, then there's necessarily one way things would turn up, or that the causal nature of things makes it so that you could know what happens next. Like, I mean, like if you jump up, you'll come down. I mean, that's just like a causal nature involving gravity. It will always do that. But you were saying, oh, what if it doesn't happen tomorrow? I mean, that could be something somebody says that I know what works now, but it might not work tomorrow. It's more like an extreme skepticism that they might want more evidence than you might rationally expect, or it's harder to evaluate the truth of different statements if you're just
Right.
going
Well,
off of like, oh, it just happened one time, it might not happen again.
well, we know skepticism can cause paralysis because you don't know what's true and you have no way to decide, really. And then
Yes.
this is like, I don't know if this is more extreme than skepticism, an extreme version of skepticism. It's almost like, to me, it seems like a light version, because if you say like, I'm 99% sure this will happen, but
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly how bad it is. I mean, clearly it's not good, and I think it's not good for the reason skepticism, extreme skepticism, is not good. I think it's really the same sort of thing. I don't know if we could go on to say that such a person is committed to destroying reason or something like that. That might be a bit extreme, but they're definitely at least undermining the basis from which they can attain certainty in life or attain understanding or knowledge about the world. They're undermining it, which then in the end could cause some kind of paralysis of not knowing. When you're not knowing anything, you just, how could you make any decision?
still pretty abstract to me, to be honest. I'd
It
need
is.
I hope there's like, I'm going to look up later. I just wrote down a fictional book on someone who is uncertain and skeptical. And hopefully I'll find some short story that might be relevant to that.
Yes.
What do you think of this then? Like, how does he know this? Its root is a feeling that has been giving precedence over logic. The feeling, in some, the feeling is cowardice. Like, how, I don't get how he knows this stuff. Where's this coming from?
I wish I had a good answer. I don't.
Yeah.
That bothers me sometimes too, and I can't really get at why that is. Other than I mean, there's no necessary thing in objectivism that you need to be looking at other people in that way. And I'm not sure really where it's coming from,
Yeah.
other than it's just coming from the way Rand writes fiction, and he's kind of imitating her style.
Yeah.
Which in fiction it might be fine, but outside of fiction you can't say that because, I mean, yeah, if you make a character and make the connections with their way of thinking, it's how they judge the world. Yeah, you could see that,
Yeah.
but you don't have that insight in the real world. You can make
Yeah.
guesses or suspect that there's something up, that they're causing problems in their own thinking, but you can't really know to the extent to which they and attack reason or hate reason. You can know they're acting against reason, but you couldn't say that they're doing it on purpose. It's harder to say unless they say they are. If they say they are, well, take them at their word. But it is strange to me also because Rand says if somebody tells you what their psychology is, just accept it at face value. Don't go telling them yourself that they don't understand their own psychology. You shouldn't tell somebody else what their psychology is if they're telling you it's wrong. I mean, you don't have the insight. You should just take them at their word, unless you have a reason to think they're lying. But usually you wouldn't. And it seems like he's psychologizing here. Like he's
Yeah.
telling you, like, oh, these people think this. Like, well, maybe sometimes, but I don't think you can know that unless you're like their psychotherapist or something.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So you're on the same page as me with that section. All right, this stuff gets interesting for me. This is where I got stuck for a while. Like,
Yes.
certainty is contextual.
It
Do
took
you
me a
remember
while too.
this?
Very well, because I had trouble with it too way back when.
Okay. So, what? I guess we can go straight to the question then, unless you want to read over
I
it.
remember it.
You remember, right? All right, cool. So it's the blood types, and then they found, just to recap, let's see, actually, A blood was compatible with that of a recipient. A blood donor was compatible with a recipient, but not of a B type. But later, a new discovery was made. In certain cases, an undesirable reaction occurred, even when a blood of type A was given an A type. So that the point is that there are other factors, but what you've discovered within the context of the circumstances so far known, A bloods are compatible. That is contextual certainty. And yeah, I said, if this is contextual certainty, how do you feel confident in anything? Like, are you going to go, oh, well, in this context, A bloods are compatible. Therefore, everyone should donate A bloods to A bloods. And then all these people die. And you're like, well, in that context, we had certainty. But now there is a new factor. And we were certain again that this and this are compatible. And then like all these people die again. You're like, oh, well, in that context, that's what I visualized in my head. I'm like, that makes no sense at all.
Yeah, surprisingly, one of the better explanations this I found was from Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'll have to find it again. Like, I was surprised when he said something in a way that just because we knew something then, we don't just throw out the past as if it was just wrong and it's useless now. It was, I had to find that again. It was insightful the way he was talking about it. But I would say that the principles you learn, the facts you learn, like when you learn that A is compatible with A, that when you're doing that, you've got at least, I mean, I get what you're saying, that it would seem that you just disproved what you just learned by saying, oh, the RH factor is what invalidates the fact that A is compatible with A. I think I would frame it more like, in some manner or other, A is compatible with A in a way that they'll never be compatible with the B. We're always certain about that. Like A, as far
Well,
as
how?
which goes, but then you could have exceptions within that to say that yes, it's true that A is compatible with A blood, but there are also other factors that can influence that fact as well. It's not that A blood is no longer compatible with A blood; it still is, but it's RH is not compatible with positive RH is not compatible with negative RH. It's not that the A's are incompatible; it's just that the RHs are incompatible. And you could say that just because you know there's another factor with blood transfusions, it doesn't invalidate the fact that A's fit with A blood types. I think that's the best way I can explain that. Because they're different things you're taking into account. It's not like you're saying, oh, A was a thing, but actually it doesn't exist at all. It's only RH. That would be different. It's not like it didn't disappear, all this knowledge about A types, B blood types, and all that. It's just you've added on to it. There's additional factors and information. I mean, clearly the RH doesn't change anything about A blood types, unless you might want to say, oh, there's a category of, maybe there's like 8 categories instead of 3. That, I think that'd be a different kind of question.
Yeah, that bit I understood, but what I don't get is, okay, well, let's look at, I don't know how of another way to think about it, but even in this specific way of thinking about knowledge, like I understand it. All right, this is what I got so far, right? So we're not saying, obviously, A bloods, once we discover this new factor, we're not saying that A bloods are incompatible with A bloods now because we discovered the RH factor. It's more like this, the way of thinking about things when you think, I mean, thinking about things this way lets you go, okay, so there must be some factor till now that we have not identified that is at play. And then it can let you investigate things properly. Like, oh, okay, there's an RH factor. That's why it didn't work in this case. So it's almost like identifying exceptions or more, getting more specialized and deep in your knowledge of the thing. But what I don't get is I don't like that certainty, but I don't feel confident then because for anything you do, or like, okay, let's say we discovered that we're scientists and we discovered that A bloods are compatible in a similar way to they did here without yet discovering the factor of RH. Now we suddenly set up this big program of transfusing blood and all these people die and have adverse reactions because we hadn't discovered the RH factor. And then I'm going to make this up a bit here. And then we discover the RH factor and we go, oh, okay, well, we were certain then, even though all these people died, but it was contextual certainty. So, this happens with contextual certainty. And then we start a new program and then all these people die again. We're like, oh, well, there's a DH factor. Okay, well, we were certain then we had contextual certainty. So, contextual certainty is contextual certainty. And now all these people die again. I'm just like, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm like, if I have contextual certainty about something, how do I feel confident if I'm like, at any given moment, there might be some like new undiscovered factor. And then when I then apply, what I get more confused is then I try to apply this epistemology. I'm like, well, it's arbitrary to think about another factor when there's no evidence for another factor. And then I die from that other unknown factor because it's arbitrary to think about unknown factors. That's what confuses me. Like, I don't get how this would work in practice, is what I'm saying.
I think part of
You
the
get that now, as opposed to saying that they're not compatible. I'm like, well, all these exceptions and additional undiscovered factors would cause to me a huge issue in having confidence.
I think part of contextual certainty is that we're not trying to use future states of knowledge to say what is certain. I mean, that might seem like getting around that problem, but I don't really think it is. I mean, take all the knowledge you have now, given that you can predict if things stay the same, what would the future be? But it's not like, oh, what might my knowledge be in 10 years? And if my knowledge increases, then what I know now doesn't apply or doesn't count anymore. I don't think you should be thinking of like, what might my future state of knowledge be? And if it might be different, then how do I really know anything? You're really just taking into account the knowledge you have now. And the knowledge you have now won't merely be invalidated as soon as you gain more knowledge. Sometimes it might be, but sometimes you just identify like an exception, or you expand the context or narrow the context. You might realize that, oh, people die. Well, you have to expand the context other than what you were looking at. There's more to take into account. And once you see that, then it's like, oh, I can't be certain now because I have to amend what I learned. I have to amend this discovery. Until then, you have what you have. And of course, you might be wrong. You're fallible, but given everything else you know and the limits in recognizing the limits of what you studied, I mean, you're not gonna, if you're gonna be a smart scientist, you don't want to overgeneralize to say that like if you know your population is of people in North America, then you don't necessarily want to generalize to people living in Asia or Africa or something like that. I mean, that's a question of how far do you generalize, but you want to be able to set your context narrow enough that you know you're capturing what you're studying versus you're just overgeneralizing. That's the difficult part.
Yeah, we could get into this later, but my issue is obviously, I get that, like, knowledge is contextual and not omniscient, but then
Yes.
are you going to, let's say we're both the scientists running this test and we say, okay, all A bloods are compatible. Are we okay then? Like, should we not be asking, are there any other factors unknown? Like, we haven't discovered anything else, but is it invalid to ask, can there be other factors at play that may be important to consider before you risk people's lives on this? Because it would be arbitrary if there's no basis of evidence for it. And in this case, yeah, it happened. Like, there was the RH factor. And then, if you would have done blood transfusions, maybe people would have died. And would you then be like, okay, well, knowledge, sometimes our knowledge fails us. That's part of living in reality. Is that the attitude?
I mean, that's part of it, but I don't think that's like the takeaway point. I mean, I think that's true. You just have to accept on some level that your knowledge will make mistakes sometimes, that it'll fail on some occasions, and that's just the way it is. But I'm thinking of say, I don't think this quote here or this paragraph is really taking into account that that your state of knowledge is always at certainty. So yes, some things will be, you haven't attained certainty yet, even within the context. He's not saying, I don't think he explained sufficiently when you've attained certainty, only that you can't have it. Because yeah, in certain cases, like a good scientist would know, like, oh, I haven't come up with enough evidence to be certain that this is even true anyway. And that's a different question, I think. What makes it sufficient to be certain? Once you attain it, sure, this applies. But I don't think he's answering, how do I know once I've attained it? Like, how do you know you hit certainty? I know that's kind of what you're asking. I mean, I think Peikoff is going on the assumption that, assuming that you've attained some sufficient certainty, whatever threshold that is, then this applies. But clearly, this wouldn't apply to before you even attain certainty. And to me, it seems like your question is more, how do I know when I even get there? Which Peikoff doesn't answer in this spot.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, this is a lot to speak about in this section for sure.
Yeah.
Anyway,